Why do you have so many R's in your name, George? And what have you done with all the other letters? Oh, right. King, Martin, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Bronte, Bronte, Bronte. Amazing authors with millions of books sold between them. But do they have anything to say about writing? Should you follow the advice from these great writers? Should you follow what they have to say about the craft? Well, today we're going to find out by examining what these great authors have to say about writing, and we'll see if you should follow their advice. Which, I mean, yeah, who am I kidding? You probably should. You know what's also great? Subscribing to my channel, because you'll get to see more videos like this one. Follow characters and situations and see where they go. Don't resort to plot. Starting with something a little divisive here. This is from Stephen King. King obviously has a lot to say about writing, and he's backed up by more success than you or I will probably ever have. All that being said, I think following advice from like really successful people can be problematic for a couple of reasons. First off, these people are often so talented that they have no real idea of what actually works and why they're so good at what they do. Like if you talk to Tom Brady about how to throw a sports ball or whatever it is he does, I don't know that he would have a lot of insight into what works because he's just so good that he doesn't necessarily know why he's so good. That's one thing. And then the other thing that tends to happen with very successful people is they followed a very specific method to achieve the success that they've achieved, and they can't imagine the possibility that somebody could do something else, that somebody could follow some other method and achieve similar or even comparable success. They get so hemmed into one method, one way of doing things, that they dismiss any other alternative. And that's what I find Stephen King does with a lot of his writing advice. King is a devout pantser. He does not outline, he doesn't plot out his novels before he writes them. He does exactly what the quote says. He sits down and sees where the story goes. That works well for him, obviously, and it works well for a lot of other people. For some writers, though, it causes some issues. A lot of people work better from an outline. They like to plot out the story before they sit down and write. Different writers do this to different levels of detail, but this idea that you can't know where the story is going, and if you do any kind of work beforehand, you're going to just ruin it and make it boring, I don't think is a universal truth. I think it's true for some people. I don't think it's true for everybody. So I think this is good advice for some people, but not all people, and there are different methods to write a novel that vary from what Mr. King is doing, and these methods have worked for other successful authors. They wouldn't work for Mr. King, but that's because everybody's different. Is not the real experience of each individual very limited, and if a writer dwells upon that solely or principally, is he not in danger of repeating himself and also becoming an egotist? Then, too, imagination is a strong, restless faculty which claims to be heard and exercised. Are we to be quite deaf to her cry and insensate to her struggles? Man, I wish people talked the way they talked in Victorian England still. Like, can you imagine what Twitter would be like? This quote is, I believe, from Emily Bronte, but I've seen it attributed to the other two Bronte sisters in different places, so I'm not 100% sure on that. I think what she's getting at here is the intersection between personal experience, empathy, and imagination. Whatever you write comes from one of those three places. It's either something that you've experienced, it's the way that you imagine it feels to experience something that you haven't experienced, that's the empathy part, or it's something that you've imagined, that's the imagination part, obviously. I think the best writing comes when you combine all three of experience, empathy, and imagination. I think, as Bronte said, if you over-rely on experience, then you risk being somewhat delusional or egotistic or writing about things that people aren't actually interested in. Most people are boring. Most people have not lived lives half as interesting as most fictional characters have. So you can't just rely on personal experience unless you've lived a very exciting life. You can't just rely on personal experience to make a story work. There's some level of imagination that has to be brought into it. Imagination is where the drama comes from. It's where the fictional nature of story really comes in, because fiction rarely looks like how real life looks. There is an imagined element to it. So I think this is again a case where oftentimes in writing you'll see this, where it's not just a case of doing more of one thing, it's a case of doing the right amount of a given thing. You need to be able to apply your own experience to the stories you're writing. Even if you haven't experienced exactly what your characters are experiencing, you've probably at one time felt similar emotions or had an experience that landed in a similar way or affected you in a similar way. You need to apply your own experience to it. You also need to understand what other people are feeling and how other people's lives have been and how other people's experiences have been. That's the empathy part of it. I think writing, a large part of it has to do with understanding other people on an emotional, on a deeper level. And then the last part is the imagination, which is taking experience and empathy and stretching them to the stretched bounds that fiction often encompasses compared to real life. Beware of a scene that becomes too dear to you, dearer than the rest. It will usually be found that it is out of drawing. That's from John Steinbeck. And he's getting at something really important here, really about ego and sort of ego versus the quality or what's best for your story. A lot of times when you're writing, you will get attached to either a character or a scene or some plot element, or maybe even an entire plot or an entire novel's story. You come up with something, you really like it, you get attached to it, you really want to make it work, but it doesn't actually work. Either the whole idea is just flawed, or an individual scene doesn't actually work in the overall scope of a novel. What you need to do, or what you should do in those situations, is get rid of that thing. Whether it's a character, whether it's a scene, delete it, get rid of it. It's going to hurt your novel. But that can sometimes be hard to do because we get attached to things, we really like them, we become proud of them, we really want to make them work, so we try to make them work. This is the point where your ego starts to dictate whether or not something should be included, rather than your real instincts about what is going to make the story good or not. You'll see this occasionally if you're ever in a writing group or you do critique for somebody and you criticize a given scene and they come back and they give you a bunch of reasons why it should work and explain how it fits in and all of that. That's a sign that your ego is starting to take over, because if the scene was actually good, it wouldn't need any support. It wouldn't need any explanation. Your writing needs to stand on its own. You can't be there to defend it. And if you leave something in that your ego really, really likes, you're not going to be able to defend it, and it's going to hurt the quality of your work. Your writing should stand on its own. You should always do what's best for the novel. Don't let your own personal feelings about a scene or any other element of your story get in the way of that. And Steinbeck actually has another quote that kind of helps with this. He says, "If a scene or a section gets the better of you and you still think you want it, bypass it and go on. When you have finished the whole, you can come back to it, and then you may find the reason it gave trouble is because it didn't belong there." That, I think, is a really good piece of advice. Nobody is a villain in their own story. George R.R. Martin. Why do you have so many R's in your name, George, and what have you done with all the other letters? Oh, right. This is getting at something that's really important when it comes to character motivations and character goals. A lot of times when people write villains or antagonists in their story, they don't give them proper motivations and proper reasons for doing what they want to do. They just sort of make the villains generically evil. They want to destroy the world or take over the world or burn down a puppy orphanage because it gives them some kind of pleasure. You need to remember that there are very few people who actually think that they're evil. And anybody who we judge as evil or malicious is often doing things that they think are right, or they have strong motivations for doing those things. This is something that Martin has obviously explored in a lot of his stories, because they very rarely have clear-cut heroes and villains. It's a lot more grayer than that. And I think you could arguably say that that's true of most real-world conflicts that have happened. There's very rarely a good and an evil side. There are two sides working to different goals that they think are good and morally reasonable. I think when you're writing villains or antagonists, you need to keep this in mind. You need to treat your villains as fully fleshed characters with goals and hopes and dreams and morals that might be considered evil by your hero or by your reader, but for that villain or that antagonist, they're doing something logical and moral and good. All right, lastly, this is from Ernest Hemingway. The first draft of anything is shit. I have absolutely nothing to add to that. He's 100% right. So this was fun. I had a good time going through all this advice and seeing what different authors are saying about writing. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and let me know down below what you think of all the advice covered here today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.